Well, greetings. I'm here with David Amram, and legendary composer, performer, educator. And I want to read a quote about you to introduce anybody who doesn't know who you are to what you've done and where you've been. The quote is from an interview with Bruce Duffy. It says, "A firm adherent to the notion of music as a spiritual, participatory activity, David Amram is a contemporary American composer and performer known for working across classical, jazz, and world music." True?
That's amazing. How long ago you
I
told me?
think that was 40 years ago.
40 years ago.
And he, I think, sums it up in a way that in which we could use the word multicultural, which is an abused and overused word, but it does characterize so much of your lifetime. And the only thing that I feel is remarkable about that, because I think in a way we're all multicultural no matter what we do.
You know it.
To some smaller or larger degree. But you were out ahead of this idea that there was no high or low music, that classical music was not better than jazz or better than Native American music or American folk music, that they were all part of one big family. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And I am happy to say I'm not the only person that thought that. My first book, Vibrations, which came out in 1968 and still being read in its sixth edition, I think more than ever, was dedicated to the great conductor Dimitri Mitropoulos. Mitropoulos, the correct pronunciation, but he said, no one can say that. They can hardly say Mitropoulos, so I say Mitropoulos. But Dimitri Mitropoulos, or Mitropoulos, felt that music was a mountain and that every stone in that mountain was precious and somehow related. He used to say to me, after I got out of the Army and was living in New York City, and once every 6 months I would call him up just to get a pep talk or an encouraging word. Your friend Dizzy Gillespie has a fascinating harmonic concept in his last record, and then he go into a whole description of one of Dizzy's solos. I'm still trying to figure out in 2025 what he did, even though I knew him since I was 19, back in I beg your pardon, I was 20, back in 1951, before my 21st birthday in November. And I could never really quite figure what he was doing, but it sure sounded good. And he was so much fun and such a fantastic performer and showman, educator and inspirer and diplomat for all music, that it never occurred to me his intellectual brilliance until I saw him take out his chess set between sets that he was performing and play chess and beat everybody.
This was Dizzy.
Yeah, he did that because he loved the science of it. So he was a combination of a brilliant scientist, you might say, the theoretician, and someone who could really do anything and everything on the spot, and someone who loved people, loved his fellow musicians, and made them feel better than ever. And Thelonious Monk was the same way, whom I met in 1955 when I was playing with Charles Mingus. I was studying composition at the Manhattan School of Music, and I loved it. But Mingus told me, he said, man, you'll learn more with me in a week than you will for the whole school year there. And finally, I got some...
Was that true?
Well, I had some wonderful teachers. Billy Ulela, who is open-minded.
Yes.
I never realized how open-minded she was until I met many other people in the academic field who were not that open-minded.
Yes.
And Vittorio Giannini, one time he could take any score and play it on the piano without worrying about transposing or sight reading something and figuring out what to play. I said, how do you play the piano that well? He said, I don't play the piano well at all. He said, but I do know music.
Uh-huh.
So he was able to transcend his limitations as a player and be a player anyway when he saw some good music that needed that.
But you also studied, if I'm not mistaken, at Manhattan with another exemplar of this point of view, Gunther Schuller. Am I right?
I sure did. Without Gunther, I'd probably still be in Germany looking for a lift back home.
How is that?
'Cause
Now,
I-
for those who don't know who Gunther Schuller is, I'll just pause for a second and say he's one of the towering figures in American music, important composer, conductor, another advocate for bringing together different kinds of music, and the founder of New England Conservatory of the Third Stream Department, along with Rand Blake, and the jazz department, one of the first jazz departments in the country at a conservatory. But go ahead. So
Well,
Gunther.
to Rand Blake, whom I'm happy you mentioned, is also one of the giants I've been privileged to
Yeah.
meet. And in fact, it was at a tribute for Gunther and myself for having written music for Wind Symphony. That's a big symphony orchestra without any strings, like a
Yes.
full-size Mahler orchestra, 6 horns and 4 oboes, 4 bassoons. Uh, I guess no more than 3 or 4 clarinets, mostly each one playing a different kind of clarinet. So there wasn't clarinets doing what violins do, having 40 clarinets trying to play a string part. It was,
Right.
and at the time that I was writing that music, I just did it because Robert Austin Boudreau, what they affectionately called this underwater orchestra, because we used to play in a barge that would sometimes go crashing into the dock and get a leak, and then fortunately it never sunk. But he commissioned more new pieces for Wind Symphony, I think, than anyone ever had. And another great conductor, Max Culpepper, that did my work, asked me to transcribe some pieces I had written for orchestra for Wind Symphony. And in fact, when I was first composer in residence for the New York Philharmonic, the piece that they played was King Lear Variations, which was full wind, brass, percussion orchestra, but with no strings playing. So a second violinist in the orchestra came up to me and he said, "Mr. Amram," he said, "I've been in this orchestra 36 years. I met them all, Prokofiev, Bartok, Hindemith, even George Gershwin, Charles Ives, Copland." He said, "I've never heard any composer whom I cared for as much as you."
Oh,
And I almost passed out. It was
yeah, it's pretty nice.
and I said, I was speechless. He said, "You want to know why?" And I said, "Please tell me." He said, "Because for the first time in my 35 years, I got 15 minutes off."
Oh, man. You had me going there.
So sometimes when you say, "I know compliments can be a drag,"
Right.
that could be correct. And Elvis Presley, I think of all the people who were out there playing Handel that the best, whether he was at Madison Square Garden or seeing his old buddies from Memphis in a neighborhood bar and someone come up and ask for an autograph. He was always gracious, and he always said, whether it's to one person or 30,000 people, "Thank you very much." That was it. He never got into the small talk, and all the people that did play with him said how wonderful he was to his fellow players,
Interesting. Wow.
and such a great guy to work with.
But back to, I don't want to leave Gunther Schuller behind
No.
because you'd still be in Germany without him. And I
Yeah.
think of you two as contemporaries in mind and in time, because he just would have been 100 at this in this year. They just celebrated his centennial, and if I may say, you are 95.
Right.
Which
Well,
is,
I met him. I was playing in Kleine Bockenheimer Straße for people that aren't familiar with Kleine Bockenheimer Straße, that's in a big city in Germany and in Frankfurt. And it was an old sort of bombed out cellar, the remains of a building I don't know what the building was like beforehand. It was, but and around the rubble, they put a roof on it, and somehow that became a jazz club.
Mm.
And he was playing on tour with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. He was the first horn and a fantastic horn player. And he said he heard someone improvising on the French horn.
Oh.
So out of curiosity, he walked in. Otherwise, I probably never would have met him. And he started talking to me. He said, I said, oh, you're the horn player that played on that Miles Davis record, The Birth of the Cool. I said, I used to listen to that every day and hoped that I could compose in a sense where I had wonderful polyphony the way you do, and also was able to use the jazz and Middle Eastern and Jewish and world folk languages in what I'm writing, because I feel that that's part of my life. And that's what I could do best. And instead of saying, well, you're crazy, you have to write using the 12-tone system or else.
Right.
He accepted that, even though he was a master of that. And he said, I just written this brass symphony. This was 1954. And I was able to listen to that when it finally came out years later. And he told me, when I mentioned Metropolis as being such a great person and great visionary and great conductor and great music stimulator to anybody and everybody, whether it was an old musician that needed to buy a new flute or a young person that hoped they could get into music, and what should they do besides play the harmonica at bar mitzvahs and wedding parties. He would treat them all with equal respect and time. And Gunther explained to me that all the world of jazz touched him, and the music of Duke Ellington especially touched him in a certain way. But he said, I don't improvise. He said, I could play anything that was written out, but I was thrilled to play on that record. But he said, you should come to Manhattan School of Music. You can get the GI Bill. I can get you in for next fall. And I can teach you some of the classical techniques that you might be interested in, not only as a horn player, but as a composer as well. And sure enough, because of that, I bumped into some students when I moved to Paris who sat in with my group, and they said they were going back on a student ship, the Utopia, and I could come along and be in the band. I said, look, I'll be 25 years old this fall. I said, I'm kind of old to pretend I'm a student. I already got a degree in European history somehow from George Washington University, but I never thought of myself as being much of a scholar, except I'm a full-time scholar in the University of Hangoutology. And I learned just from being with people better than I'll ever be, a little more. And that's what I'm still doing today as we speak in 2026, about to roll around the clock. And this was 1954 that I was with Gunther. He said, no, you come with me. He said, you'll learn something and you'll be in New York, and there's all kinds of musicians that would love to hear you improvising. The only other improviser is Julius Watkins. And he plays completely different than you. And there are all these other great horn players like James Buffington and John Barrows at that time, who were terrific players that would appreciate you're taking the horn as not being a freak instrument.
Right.
He said, there's no such thing as a jazz instrument until Barney Bogard came along.
Of course not. Yeah.
No one ever heard of Albert Nicholas and some of the...
Well, you must have met Gil Evans, who elevated the use of the French horn.
Oh, sure. Well, they one or two bands did have French horns playing. Claude Thornhill
Of course, that's right.
Had always had one French horn player who was wonderful,
Yeah,
but he played just parts.
I see.
And there was a John Gross played out in the West Coast, but he was mostly a studio musician and never really, went out, formed his own group and went on the road and got stiffed several times, but learned how to play music and learned what the life was like in different circumstances.
Mhm.
But I felt, well, gee, there's someone that really appreciates what I'm doing outside of the jazz world. And I was always touched by written music. And when I finally heard the Brass Symphony, I said, wow, I'd like to conduct that someday.
Mm.
And I imagine with his 100th anniversary, I do a lot of stuff when I'm invited for the Gunther Schuller celebrations
Yeah.
and participated in a little video tribute to him. But Rand Blake, whom you mentioned earlier, when I was with Gunther at the New England Conservatory, when they had Gunther and myself, I had fortunately the good luck in his presence to thank him.
Mm.
As they used to say in the 19th century, thank you for all he had done, not just for me, but for music, to have a faculty with such tremendous jazz players that were also tremendous teachers and tremendous people that loved the idea of music education, of making the students feel confident and comfortable and learn something.
Yeah.
And when I was with the Woodwind Quintet the first year, we studied the Schoenberg Woodwind Quintet. We could only get past the first page.
Right.
But Gunther knew it upside down and inside out. And when I went years later to the beautiful place that he had out close to Idaho.
Oh, yes.
It was just so much fun. He was like the old Gunther that I knew way back when I met him in those years. And he always was a big-hearted, beautiful person. He would sometimes get impatient. And I explained to musicians, I said, look, you're speaking to a guy who's 2 years ahead of all of us. But he figures if you don't know that, you should know it. Shame on you for not knowing it.
Well, he's a guy who, and I once had the opportunity to interview him, and I know his sons. He never got a degree. He learned pretty much on his own, just by transcribing scores. But something you said struck me because I think often there is one person who we meet at a formative time that changes our direction, often simply by saying, I understand you.
That's a great way of putting it.
And then all of a sudden you go, wow, all these things that I've wished for and wanted to do are so strange. They're possible.
Oh, no question. I remember when I was a teenager, I heard Josh White Sr. play.
Wow.
And I had the pleasure of eventually doing a program with the symphony that you've heard, that Woody Guthrie Symphony, This Land. The second half, we had Josh come out and sing some folk songs. Well, the orchestra was shocked because as soon as they heard her start to sing, they realized this was not just some washed-up Broadway hack that got lucky being in a hit musical or something, but some fantastic musical artist. And at the same time, I was able to do some of Woody's music that inspired me to write the symphony that was, as people have heard it, thank God we were able to record it with the Colorado Symphony, where that great orchestra was able to play all that stuff. I don't know how they ever did it. And for the second half of the same program, do a tribute to that kind of music. And then they stared at me because I became the side man playing piano and percussion and a French horn and penny whistles with Josh White Jr., the soloist, and was able to do that comfortably, not because I was a dilettante, but because I had also spent a good part of my life playing with fabulous singer-songwriters and learning what to do and when not to do anything
Yes.
to fit into each and every one of them, what they were doing. Or when I played with Jacques and he'd just make up something on the spot, how to do that by feeling. And as far as any technical schooling, there was no university of hangoutology to learn how to do that.
Learn
Or to
on the
play
spot.
jazz on the French horn. There wasn't anybody doing it. So Julius and I both played completely different than one another. And we both had the opportunity of not having to be forced to copy
Yes.
what someone else had already done so beautifully.
Well, you also spoke in one of the interviews I read about you about how part of what gave you your feel for composing for orchestra and chamber music groups was that you were an improviser and that you had spent your life playing with other people that, especially in I think the 50s and 60s, there were plenty of composers who really had never played with anyone. They didn't have the experience of an audience sitting out there listening to them or communicating with fellow musicians. Am I right?
You're absolutely right. And it took me till I was in my 90s, I'm 95 as we speak, that part of it was the composer writing something down, really making it clear what you hope it will be. So the poor player or the poor conductor or the singer or the soloist won't have to say, I wonder what he meant by that. I tried to make it really clear. And when my gentleman who copied my music for 50 years, it was so terrific, said to me once, he said, David, he said, that's a nice piece, but you're a control freak. I said, what do you mean? He said, you write down all those things. He said, a good musician would know how to do that. I said, not necessarily.
Right.
Because they're going to say, I wonder what he meant by that. So I try to make it as clear as possible. But that's only the first step. Then you get people to play it. And if they're looking at it and they practice the part and they say, what kind of a blank blank is this blank blankety blank composer trying to lay on me? I've been playing the viola for 40 years. This is unplayable and it's ugly. Possibly it could be done in a different way that would say something that would be beautiful horizontally and vertically, as 300 years of music before Bach was. When he came along, he had a 300-year background of that beautiful, what they call polyphony, all the music happening at the same time, where you could go blang any place in the score and hear a chord or hear something to the next one, blang, and play it in slow motion. And every note would be a winner. And when you hear Charlie Parker or Buster Bailey or Big Spiderbeck playing a solo that's improvised, you say, wow, I couldn't have ever dreamed of doing anything better myself because it's saying something. Or when I play with Willie Nelson, hear him sing a song, and just somehow it couldn't be done any better than the way he does it at that moment.
Okay, we got to pause for a second. One of my real heroes, Willie Nelson. When did you perform with Willie and what did you do?
Well, when I first actually played with him, I didn't recognize him because I was conducting the Corpus Christi Orchestra and I had a few days off. And Steve Goodman, a great guitar player and folk singer.
Oh, yeah. City of New Orleans.
Yeah, he called up and said, Dave, he said, I'm playing at the Opry House here in Austin, and I saw in your schedule you have 4 days off between rehearsals because it was basically at that time still almost like a community orchestra. Excellent, a wonderful time. Maurice Perez conducted, also was someone who loved it was the first time the Modern Jazz Quartet ever played with the symphony. It was with Maurice, and he orchestrated the Duke Ellington, Black, Brown, and Beige, and other pieces, and which are played all the time. So Maurice said, "Hey," said, "if you got the time off, do it." So I spoke to the woman who ran the Corpus Christi Orchestra, and I said, "I've been asked, Letitia, to play at the Opry House." She said, "There's no Opry House in Austin." I said, no, it's not. They don't do Puccini and
Right.
Rossini and the great composers that we love. That's called the Opry House, like the Grand Ole Opry, and they just play folk music and sort of jazz-oriented folk music. She said, "Well, if you're a grown-up man, if you can get there and back in time, go to it. And tell them all about our orchestra down here in Corpus." I said, "Yes, ma'am." So I went down there, and Jethro Burns, a fantastic mandolin player who had been with a comedy group for a duo for years and years, Homer and Jethro, finally,
Right.
Homer had passed away, and I think Jethro just felt he had done it all. He was just sitting at home playing with his son's group when his son, who's a wonderful guitar player, would invite him to come and play with him. And Steve ran into him and said, "Look, Jethro, come on on the road with me." And he said, I'm too old for that stuff." He said, "No, you'll have a ball." And Jethro was like a reborn person. So they were playing as a duo. And suddenly this guy walked up with a headband, long hair, carrying a drink in one hand, I'll never forget, came walking up on the bandstand in the middle of a tune and started singing all these incredible harmony parts. And some of Steve's music was not easy just to barge into. You had to really check it out structurally, harmonically, to see what notes to play and what notes to leave out. I said to Jethro, I said, "Man," I said, "who is that guy sitting in with us like that?" He said, "Dave, that's with a capital H, Willie Nelson. He's the co-owner of the club."
Oh.
I said, "Oh." So we went back at his office and spent all night talking and hanging out after the show was over. He's just an amazing person, and exactly what you would imagine he was like off stage as he is when you see him on stage, just full of love and brilliant and funny, soft-spoken, and he could come up with the greatest one-liners.
They're all over his songs.
Right, exactly. After you gave a 45-minute speech.
There's one on one of his more recent records. The title, I don't know if he wrote the lyric, is "I had a 7-year itch and I did it in 3." That's the name of the song. But all right, but while we've touched on jazz, we've touched on country music, we've touched on the concert music you've done, and I want to mention one other thing that really stands out for me when I look at your CV, because to some degree you've been involved in Native American music.
Yeah.
And my experience growing up and till now is that of all the musics in our country or their country, depending on what your perspective is, that's a culture that is the hardest to have access to if you're interested in the music or the spirituality, whatever it may be. And we don't need to get into the reasons, but very little of that music has made its way into concert music or jazz or anything else. So tell me how you became involved and what your involvement has been. My perspective is that this is incredible music.
Yeah.
You know, when I hear it at its source, it never fails to send chills up my spine. And I'm interested in your participation in that culture.
Sure. Well, it would be, I would say, cultures in the plural.
Yes.
There were over 1,000. There's still so many today. When I was at Taos Pueblo, and they did a piece of mine that I had written for the Philadelphia Orchestra called Trail of Beauty.
Yes.
for oboe, mezzo-soprano, and orchestra. I had the chance to write a piece for the Philadelphia Orchestra, whom I grew up in the closest place to Feasterville, Pennsylvania, where our farm was at that time, was Philadelphia, one of the top orchestras in the world. The first orchestra concert I went to was taken by my uncle, and Leopold Stokowski himself was conducting the kids' concert. And then 30-some years later, I met Mr. Stokowski. Said, I know you wrote that piece with the Indian music. He said, what will this one be like? And I said, well, Maestro, I'm going to try to use Native American music. And he said, wonderful. Then when I finally wrote the piece and showed it to Eugene Ormandy, before he opened the page, he said, in this Hungarian accent, Indian music, hopeless, too simple, too simple. It's monotonous. It's worse than jazz. I heard the choral concerto you wrote for Mason Jones use jazz, too much jazz and that Latin Finnish music. That's too much. But this music is all hiya dada, hiya dada, hiya dada. I said, Maestro, that's only played in the beer commercials. I never heard any place. The 40 years I played with Floyd Red Crow Westerman as his backup player whenever he would want me, I never heard anybody doing that. There's all different kinds. God, he said, it's a bit disaster. It's too simple. I said, well, Maestro, here's one that has an A, B, B form, if you look at it that way. And it uses mixed meters, and it goes, it's a Cheyenne war dance. It goes, and he said, it's too complicated. So I saved that for another piece I wrote later on.
But wait a minute. How did you learn that piece? It's not as simple as just, walking up to a Cheyenne man and saying, can you teach me your music?
Oh, Lord, no. I heard it. I just liked it. He said, well, Dave.
You heard it on a record?
No, it was on tour with Floyd.
Oh.
And he said, He said, you can learn that, but he said, just remember, it takes us 10 years to learn a song correctly.
Wow.
So he said, you do it and play it with me. And he said, other ones that we played together, and mostly he played guitar and sounded sort of like Johnny Cash.
Yes, I saw him perform.
He was terrific.
Yeah.
But he did traditional music too. And I found out that so many people did that, but usually not in public because they have what they call social songs,
yes,
which are for dances, mostly when people get together and dance. And you're invited. They have ladies' choice dances, which was the main one that I used for the piece that I did write for Ormandy, which was simple. And Ormandy said, play it for the boys. They didn't have any women in the orchestra, right, except for the harp player back then. And a wonderful cellist, Elsa, but everything else was all men. And they were grown-ups, but they were called the boys.
Right.
Because that was the way, for people who were concerned about the treatment of musical artists, it's never been a glamorous situation if you weren't sitting up in the front. And at any rate, so much of the music comes from the drum.
Yes.
And you find out that the drum, as drum machines prove, do not keep time, because the human heart doesn't go back, 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 back like a machine. It varies somewhat.
Yes.
Each person has their own heartbeat, and the drum and instruments like the flute that I've found 140,000 years old, they've been around for a long time and are still here. So they touch something that we'll never understand, but is there. So when you learn a song and you know how to say please, and then you learn to say thank you, and then you learn to say, could you show me that one more time, please, a little slower.
Uh-huh.
And then finally, what kind of a scale or mode is that you're playing in? And the style, Floyd would say, well, that usually takes 30 or 40 years just to figure it out, to do it really right. But then he said in many of the pueblos or reservations, they'll have someone and they know that's the person who was born to sing that song and carry on our tradition. So there's so many different traditions. And when I play with Floyd, sometimes we'd be done a concert and everyone would go out to a great big fireplace and sing all night long. I remember I went to one place and everybody singing at the fireplace was just incredible. I said, man, that's really something. How did you guys ever learn to do that so well? They said, we listened to those old records that were made in 1910 on not recording equipment as we know it now, that are sitting in the library. We figure, well, that's our grandparents or great-grandparents singing. We're going to learn from those all the phrasing. So they learned from what the anthropologists thought was something they could take out of the junk heap and made it into a living art form. And now there are composers, many, who are Native American, who are writing their own music.
Yes.
And I've done in the Ode to Lord Buckley, my saxophone concerto, I used a lot of music from Southeast Asia and places in the Middle East, and different things that I've learned that just touched my heart, and I figured I would try to learn them, or at least learn the style or the feeling, and learn the different percussion parts.
Right.
Boom. And so it was like the dombek, where I would play boom, deep back, boom, boom, back, deep boom, deep back, boom, variation, boom, boom, back, deep back, boom, back, get a boom, deep boom, 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 bang, beep, boom, tick, down, go, don't go, tick, and it's all coming from the and the Cuban three forms of the clave, which are used in many kinds of music, the 3-2, 1, 2, 1, 2. The reverse of that, used in the mambo and comparsa, 1, 2, 1, 2. And the trick is one of them all, the rumba clave, that really puts your marriage in jeopardy, because no one can stand hearing somebody practicing 24 hours a day going, 1, 2. And each one of those claves has 100 different rhythmical parts that can be played with it.
Right.
And if you play without it, Candido gave the best explanation of why he didn't bother to correct people. I had one called Havana, New York that I wrote. So I sang, Candido, no hay problema, there's no problem here, Candido. Es un dos, tres. Dong, ding, dong, ding, 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 ding. He said, no, Davey. No es dos, tres, es tres, dos. He said, no, Davey. It's not a 2-3 clave, it's a 3-2.
Mm-hmm.
I said, oh, I thought it was 3-2. I thought it was 2-3. He said, could be, but it's wrong. So I finally asked Mario Bauza, who is sort of the Beethoven of all Latin music, and I was able to combine those wonderful musicians when he was with Candido, or with Machito. And I said, well, I know everybody asks you this, Mario, but how do you know when it's a 3-2 or whether it's a 2-3? Or they said, well, sometimes I don't know. I said, oh my God. What do you do then? He said, I ask Machito. He has no knowledge formally of music, but his instinct is perfect.
Wow, interesting.
And so that's the kind of the key for all music.
Yes.
There's certain handles, certain instincts that you can learn, and the phrasing, the timing, but mostly the speaking to you, speaking to your heart from the music.
Yes.
And when you're composing something, you write it down. Hopefully, the person taking the violin, cello, or bassoon out of their car or truck or bus, opening it up, putting it together, and then they spent 40 years playing the heck out of it. And having them look at the piece of paper with the flashbacks, known as notes, written down, and then having them maybe saw away and play a little bit of it. Hopefully they'll feel something.
Yes.
And they'll put how they feel about that into the music. And if it's an orchestra and the conductor encourages that creativity, they're doing what's there, but in a certain way that makes the audience feel something.
Yes.
Then the audience sends that feeling back, and the person playing then sends back what they've received to make them feel it more and sends it out the second time. Then you got music.
Yeah.
And that's something that's inexplicable.
Yes.
You can't prove that with a computer or getting a jury to say, is it talking to me or ain't it?
Well, but you know what? Something I want to note is that Floyd Westerman, the Native American guitar player, singer, was your point of entry to this music. He trusted you. So he was willing to show you some of the intricacies of this music. And what that says to me, earning that trust, tells me a lot about who you are. Well, because your curiosity, first of all, was the driver. A genuine curiosity. I'm not doing this to make money off of you. I'm doing it because the music's touching my heart. That's why I want to learn it. But also, your ears are incredibly open to different things, and that's a way of living, and it sounds like you've taken for granted in a sense your whole life, that openness.
Well, I've tried to be. I never thought of being that way. It's just that when something touched my heart, I would go for that.
Yeah.
And try to not to be, I'm not being racial. What I'm saying is just colloquial. Not to be mighty whitey.
Right.
Not to be slumming.
No, but to be genuinely present.
Exactly.
Something you loved.
Not to be gracious to the underprivileged, the most racist possible attitude anybody can have.
Yes.
Coming from supposedly a different point of view. Just keeping it for real.
Yeah.
And also the idea I learned on a farm of doing a good job.
Yeah.
Just basic stuff like that.
Basic stuff.
That unfortunately we overlook.
Yes.
Or are educated to everything except those simple homilies, I guess you'd call them. Because people would say, we know all that simple stuff. Tell us a secret.
Yeah.
There is no secret. It's just you have to figure you're devoting your life to something that you love and something that you'll never understand completely.
Yeah.
And that magic that somehow occurs is something like the changing of the seasons or whales swimming 1,000 miles one way and coming back the other way and finding their way underwater, or those birds that we see going south in the winter and then going to the North Pole in the summer and landing in the same pond each year both ways of quite a few times. I mean, who could figure that out? Well, I'm of the opinion you don't try to figure that out.
Yes.
You just know that it's there, it's strong, but it's spiritual.
Hmm.
But you don't even use the word spiritual as little as possible at any rate,
Yes.
because then you automatically think of the huckster salesman franchising something they know nothing about, taking an old religions and philosophy that they know nothing about and slopping them all together to give you a 30-second instant
Yeah.
whatever they're trying to sell. So that feeling is something it's a mystery, and
Yes.
it remains a mystery. So all you can do is you could, as when you're composing, ultimately you're taking your experiences and trying to write something down. And then you have the chance, rather than improvising, you could look at it the next day and say, man, whoever would want to play this crap? or
Right.
secondly, it's brilliant, but it's ugly.
Uh-huh.
So unless you're trying to create a horrifying, ugly experience, I did that in the score for the Manchurian Candidate when the guys were going nuts. I just picked all the wrongest notes for that one feeling. And some of the critics who gave it a wonderful review said, avant-garde composer.
Right.
I said, avant of what? I've been a derriere, a backwards composer, going back to Palestrina and on up.
Let's talk about that for a second, because it's something you're known quite well. I think it's one of the things that people know about you if they know nothing else. Oh, that's the guy who scored the Manchurian Candidate, because the movie's been seen by so many people and it's such a striking score. And you did a number of other film scores around that time, and that one obviously very successful. But two questions here. What was the experience like for you working on the Manchurian Candidate, and especially in light of today, since it seems so prescient? And second of all, you probably could have had a very lucrative career just doing that. You might have moved to LA and done very, very well in just that one venue. Why did you decide not to specialize in that?
Well, I have things I was dying to do and still dying to do them and happy when I can. Specifically, being able to play with my group or with strangers that I never met and getting that good feeling of a connection of being in someone else's world, and hopefully encouraging them to, especially younger players, for at least a fraction of their lives, repaying the tuition from the University of Hangoutology from those who taught me who are no longer here or hanging out with somebody else. And things that I just felt I couldn't do. I did Splendor in the Grass before that. And that was a completely different film, a completely different idiom, a different story. And again, the director, Elia Kazan, loved Chopin and loved jazz. John Frankenheimer loved every kind of music and literature.
Yeah.
They were both brilliant guys, and they loved the films that they were making, and they stood there like fanatics, just getting everything right. What my music copyist would have accused me of being a control freak. It was only they wanted it to be everything to be right, and then let the actors go and let the magic happen that only they could bring.
Sounds like a great jazz group.
Exactly. They had the
Jazz orchestra.
the same philosophy, and also the way a symphony is.
Yes.
When Leonard Bernstein said, look, I want all my recordings, when he went to Europe and gave up Columbia Records, gave up the Philharmonic and everything, he wanted all his recordings to be recordings, documents of what he felt was the real deal, that catharsis of coming from the people playing to the people listening, back to the players and conductor, if there is one, back to the audience, and around a second time. And the person who told me about that was Tony Bennett. When I played some funky interview program he'd been playing in Camden, New Jersey, in between hit songs, and I could hardly talk. But when he got up and sang, all the women who were sitting there with dyed blue hair, looking like we were in a funeral parlor, suddenly came to life. He just brought that feel. And then he started singing in that gorgeous voice that he had. And he said, no, it just came to me from them. And I gave it back to them, and then they gave it back to me. And by the time we did the program, I was ready. And he said, that's what we call catharsis. And he said, the person that told me about that was Louis Armstrong. And I said, wow, that's the same thing as when I saw Segovia come out and just walk on stage like he was going to clean up the stage, sit down on a stool and start playing with no sound system. And 4 minutes later, we were all hypnotized as if we were sitting in the kitchen. He changed that whole feeling, and the audience listened so hard, they changed the whole feeling.
Yes.
And those are things that you never forget. And it's a shame that somehow they don't teach the fact that the part of real music, whether you're composing, playing, improvising, whatever you're doing, is that sharing with one another, the respect for the people that you're doing it with and the people you're doing it for, and that is all precious.
The human connection.
Exactly.
Well, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, part of why you're saying that is you grew up in a time where serialism was king. Now, I was on the tail end of that. But it was really severe in the classical world. You, if I'm not mistaken, to a certain degree, you were just considered a
caveman,
lowlife if you didn't buy into that whole system.
Yeah.
And even Gunther, whose music is, I mean, really, I think, I never call it avant-garde. It's beautiful music. It can be severe and there can be dissonance, but it's beautiful, approachable music. He used a 12-tone system, I think, for many of his pieces, one of the same rows, I was told. So meanwhile, you're coming along at that same time. Were you ever tempted? Said, let me try this out. Let me see if it works for me. Or from an early age, did you just hear something different?
No, I just felt that they, Arnold Schoenberg and Webern, and most of all, Alban Berg, wrote music that was so stunning and sounded so good. They had done that. And Stravinsky came along. And I felt that for composers who felt the orchestras were getting to be too enormous, that was kind of a good thing to clean house and start all over again. And all of them were wonderful composers, but they did that. And I mean, you read Schoenberg's book, the last thing that you ever would see was, you must use my system or else. And that was all that I ever knew about him until I was told by Hugh Reagan, great trumpet player whom I met when he was in high school, when I was with the Houston Symphony and they played the first half classical pieces and the second half I played with my jazz group. He was someone that could do both idioms with love and he came to the new school, had a bunch of kids playing, and several of the pieces he wrote were 12-tone jazz pieces. He said, just remember, it's got to have that dance. In other words, he wanted it to be celebratory. Secondly, the people who played it were so terrific. I couldn't believe that they were playing music that was not easy by any means. And I was playing horn part that was written for me that was easy, and I could scarcely play that the way it should be. But he said, just remember, David, he said, you get to page, it was in the 30s, he's somewhere, he said, if you feel that you've read the book this far and it hasn't helped you to be more creative, then throw the book away.
Interesting.
Now, I never knew, he said, most people don't realize what a great sense of humor Schoenberg had, because all I read were mostly reports of Stravinsky saying how he despised Schoenberg's attitude. But then I realized, of course, that Stravinsky, who owned music I love, unfortunately I guess, came up in such a hard time. He was kind of jealous and angry at anybody. He called the composer of Vernon Duke, who had his name, had to call himself Dukelski to get recognition. He kept referring to as the composer of Pesach in Portugal instead of Autumn in New York.
Oh, God.
But and a classic statement, which is helpful to all of us, he went to some contest where they were showing who could write the best piece or something of that sort. And he said, that was an extraordinary piece, but it went on 15 minutes after it had ended. Right. So in a way, he also taught us, he said, that writing his ballets enabled him to write that amazing music because he had limitations. Certain things where Diaghilev would say Iggy or something into that.
Right.
I want 45 seconds of terrifying music, and then it's made up, the people make up for the moment and have it be nice again, and then go back to being terrifying, terror-seeking or terrorizing again.
Yes.
And he had a way of taking Diaghilev's construction of exactly what to do and work within all those limitations. He said that makes it easier. And I extended that to my own feelings of work within your own limitations. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I'll listen back to a solo I played and say, boy, I wonder how the hell I did that. I'm glad I don't have to write it down. On the second, at the second time, you can write something that someone else can play, and they'll put themselves into it, and it's, wow, it sounds good.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be really simple and soulful, and sometimes it can be very complicated, and sometimes it could just be icing on the cake. And it's different, but the main thing is to, like cooking a good meal, to really escape from just the recipe and get into that other stuff.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here as we begin to close down this fantastic conversation. You've been around a lot longer than most people. You've seen, important eras in American music at their gestation or at some golden periods. The bebop movement, the beat poetry movement. You met Bernstein. You've written some important film scores, and you jammed with Willie Nelson and God knows how many other singer-songwriters. But I'm sure there's a long, long list. For younger people watching this, what are 5, 6 recordings across all genres and styles that you think lie at the heart of this participatory experience in music that has been something you've witnessed and partly chronicled for your 95 years?
Well, I would say certainly the birth of the cool.
Oh, yes.
That where those composers, and Johnny Carisi and so many, George Wallington, so many others, Gil Evans, of course.
Him. George Wallington.
Yeah, he wrote God, ding, 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 ding. I can't sing it properly for you. But it's one of the great pieces. He was a pianist and a terrific player. And they did one of his pieces, Miles' music, Gil Evans' arrangements. And this was 1949, I believe it came out. Yeah. And I listened to that before I went into the Army. And some of the harmonic structure of Dave Brubeck's music is so extraordinary. All the jazz players, when you hear Big Sid Catlett playing the drums, Bix Beiderbecke, certainly when he did I'm Coming Virginia, and did that fantastic solo in the middle of it, that's what made me want to go into classical music, because I could hear that and the Bach Brandenburg Concerto Number 2. And that one, I said, boy, there's a trumpet like Bix Beiderbecke playing with an orchestra with polyphony, and every note when he improvised and when he played just sounded perfect and touching. And still, I listened to it recently and still got that feeling. I was 14 years old again. And hearing Yossele Rosenblatt, the great Jewish cantor who sang so, he could have sung in the Met, and he's just stayed singing sacred music because he felt that was a calling that he shouldn't give up. And then hearing some of the other wonderful folk musicians that I've heard, so many that I could spend the whole day mentioning them.
Yeah.
And there's songs and sets of setting poetry to music, hearing some of the beautiful the recording I have of La Bohème by Puccini, where Gunther was playing first horn in the orchestra. I got the recording listening so I could hear the first horn, but then I heard Bido Sayao, who was singing. I said, oh my Lord. And hearing the old piano players like Clifford Courteau and Solomon, and people would say they have spotty techniques, but boy, would they musical. If they had a clam, they didn't have a way of redoing it, but it was a live feeling, like when you hear Fritz Freisler. Now when I hear some of those 10-year-olds who are being discovered every week, Jacob Collier, I think that's his name. He's not 10 years old. I listened to that. I said, good Lord, how can anybody write such good harmonic stuff for voices and find people to sing those parts and get it right ever? Then I realized he was doing it all himself. I said, holy cow.
Yeah.
That guy is some wizard.
Yeah.
And there's so many of and then of course the hearing Native American music and hearing Kulthum, the great Arabic singer, and then hearing Charlie Parker, who loved all those musics and always made everything so beautiful, and Sonny Rollins, whom I knew when I played with Mingus, hearing them, and now listening and re-listening to people that I played with on old records. My son-in-law, Bram, from Holland, also loves older music, and he's got a huge, bigger collection than I ever have, carefully notated. I kept saying, who's that? Who's that? Who's that? Can we hear that again? And I hear people, I say, good Lord, I played with them, even some records that I'm on. And I say, how could I dare have even played in the same room with those guys? And it's too late now because I already did it. There are a lot of things that I appreciate, and then things that I remember hearing when I was a teen, hearing the Philadelphia Orchestra when I was a kid, and hearing Duke Ellington's big band playing recently, and then going to hear some of the programs Wynton's done on Wynton Marsalis has done on television, where they have these young people are playing so great.
Yeah.
And one he has with Eric Clapton and Taj Mahal together is just fantastic. There's all kinds of wonderful things that are happening, and wonderful things that are happening in little places you can go to hear people who are just starting out. And essentially, that's what we're all doing, is just starting out. And once you get interested in the music and you make music the star, you're doing what Toscanini said when he had a major diva from the Metropolitan Opera sing in a concert performance of La Bohème, not a staged opera performance, but a concert performance. And at one point, she held out a note for about a minute where there was no fermata. That's the bird's eye that you see. Oh, and this says, I mean, you just hold it out or do what you want to. He said, Madam, he said, your voice is a gift of God, but the composer Puccini, because he wrote such unusual music with different kinds of expressions within each measure, and drove his publishers crazy by changing it 10 times before it was finally published. He said, he certainly indicates if he wanted that note held out, he would have put something over it or wrote a piacere or something. He said, we have to obey the feelings of the composer too. And she said, but maestro, I'm a star. He said, Madam, you have the voice of a gift of God as a gift of God, but there are only stars in heaven. And John Cooper of the Red Dirt Rangers, they've been together 35 years, and they're Oklahoma's #1 kind of red dirt funk, jazz, folk, country music, rock orchestra. They're amazing players, and I'd love to play with them every year I go to Oklahoma to play at a Woody Fest and play with them in Tulsa and wherever else we get together. I said, John, I said, man, you guys always sound so good. And every time you come up and play, wherever it is, whatever has been happening, the minute you open your mouth and everybody starts singing and playing, it just changes everything. He said, well, Dave, he said, our philosophy is music is the boss.
You know, that is a great place to end.
Right.
The music is the boss.
Right.
And I think the boss is proud of you for what you've done over the past, well, let's see, 80 years of composing, more?
Yeah, I guess, I think.
And French horn playing and
playing
percussion and all the rest.
The thing is, without sounding disrespectful, not to wreck it.
Well, David Amram, we're so pleased and honored to have you here at the Bearsville podcast studio. And it's really been a pleasure getting to know more about you and talk about your amazing career in life.
Well, thank you. I never wanted to have a career.
But you actually had one, which is pretty extraordinary in and of itself as a composer.
My hope is, I hope someday my music has a career. And as a composer, I've used the hopelessness of it all as a plus to try to do everything I could so I could compose music that would make some contribution and be saying something so musicians would want to do it. And usually in our society, the musicians are treated like disposable toilet plungers, where you can always get another. We just go down to the hardware store and pick one up. And there's so many fantastic musicians around, and we owe the musicians so much that the least those of us who are lucky enough to write stuff down on paper and have it performed by people because they want to do it is a blessing and an honor, because they have enough pieces by Mozart, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky,
yes,
and the American giants like now we have to include Leonard Bernstein. There's finally starting to appreciate his classical compositions, and Charles Ives and Copland and so many other people that they don't really need us. They don't need anybody to write any more music. But for those of you who want to pursue what's told by career counselors, lawyers, and experts to be a hopeless field, I say just because it's hopeless is no reason not to do it anyway. And if you feel you were put here to do something you should respect that calling, and whatever you have to do to pay the rent, find a way to somehow do it.
Thank you. Beautifully spoken. Thanks for being here.
Well, listen, thank you for inviting me. And for all folks listening, practice if you want to play. And secondly, if you're a parent or a relative of someone who's taking that hopeless course, encourage them.
Yes.
And it'll make them a better doctor, lawyer, astronaut, bus driver, whatever their non-musical gig is to pay the rent. They'll be able to do that and enjoy life a lot more if they also can continue to do what they feel they were put here to do.
Wonderful. David Amram,